The funeral began under a pale gray morning. I stood beside the coffin, both hands trembling as I tried to arrange the old photographs of my husband, Dr. Groff. William Hale, a man the town called the Heart Doctor. The lilies were already wilting from too many condolences. The air smelled of disinfectant and wet earth, a scent I used to associate with hospitals, now with endings. And then she appeared. A woman in her 60s, maybe a little older, walked slowly down the aisle. Her hair shimmered between silver and gold under the church light. Around her shoulders was a sea blue scarf that looked almost too alive for a day of mourning. She didn't look at me. She went straight to the coffin, placed her hand on William's chest, and whispered, so softly I might have missed it if the room hadn't fallen so silent. Sleep well, Blue Jay. The sound of it made my stomach twist. Blue Jay. I had never heard that name before. Not once in 30 years of marriage. No one called him that. Not our students, not his colleagues, not even his mother. It was as if, for a brief moment, I'd heard a stranger's farewell spoken over my husband's body. She lifted her head and turned to me with a small, knowing smile. Her eyes were calm. Too calm. You must be Margaret, she said. I'm Elise. An old friend. He spoke of you often. My throat went dry. It took effort to find my voice. That's strange, I managed. Never mentioned you. For a heartbeat, the church stopped breathing. Somewhere, a chair creaked. The priest cleared his throat. Outside, the wind brushed against the stained glass window. The faint flutter of wings, or maybe just my imagination. Elise's smile didn't fade. She only nodded. The kind of nod people give when they know something you don't, and never intend to tell you. Then she stepped aside, folded her hands, and bowed her head as if nothing had happened. I tried to focus on the service, but the word kept looping in my mind, sharp as a wire cutting through the quiet. Blue Jay. Blue Jay. Blue Jay. The more I heard it in my head, the less I recognized the man inside that coffin. Every story, every late-night call, every conference trip blurred together, and behind them all, a shadow I'd never seen. Someone touched my shoulder. You okay, Mrs. Hale? I nodded before realizing my hands were shaking so hard the photo frame slipped from my grip. The glass cracked when it hit the floor. A tiny sound, but everyone turned. Elise was the first to kneel and pick it up. She ran a thumb over the broken corner, then handed it back to me with that same gentle smile. He loved this one, she said. One by the lake. I stared at the picture. William and me, 20 years younger, smiling in the sun. But I remembered something then. He'd refused to frame it for years. Said it didn't feel right. Now, it was lying cracked between us, and the only thing I could think was, why her? Why that name? The priest's voice echoed faintly through the pews. May his soul rest in eternal peace. But my mind was elsewhere. Chasing a name I had never heard, down corridors of memory I suddenly didn't trust. I felt my pulse in my wrists, fast and hot, the same way I used to feel before opening the darkroom door at work. That moment before you see what the film really captured. And in that instant, I knew. The man I'd buried was not the man I'd known. Or maybe he had simply been both. For 30 years, I thought I knew every note in the symphony of our marriage. But that morning, standing beside his coffin, I realized there was a melody he'd kept just for someone else. When William and I first married, we had nothing except a used Toyota, 2 suitcases, and the kind of belief that youth mistakes for certainty. He had just finished his residency. I was restoring damaged photographs for a museum. We rented a 2-room apartment above a bakery. The air always smelled like yeast and burned sugar, and turned the smaller room into his first clinic. The waiting chairs were old theater seats I'd bought at an auction for $20. I painted them white and pretended they matched. I handled the paperwork. Permits, insurance, invoices. William handled the people, their fears, their hearts, their gratitude. For 6 years, I sat behind that narrow reception desk every day from dawn to dusk, stamping receipts until the numbers blurred. I learned to translate medical bills into kindness. This one paid by a fisherman who brought us oysters. That one from the widow who insisted on paying in quarters. He didn't have children. He used to say, It's all right, Maggie. I only need you. And I believed him, because when a man says something in a voice that gentle, you stop asking what he's leaving out. At night, he'd sit by the kitchen table, sketching anatomical diagrams on napkins. Always, in the bottom right corner, a tiny bird appeared. Blue wings, short beak, mid-flight. I assumed it was habit, an artistic twitch of his medical mind. Now, when I close my eyes, I can still see that bird. It was never just a doodle, it was a door. By the 10th year, his name began to appear in journals, on panels, on brass plaques. Mine stayed on bills. I kept every one of them. 10,240 invoices, folded into neat envelopes labeled by year. 24 years of records, proof that our life had structure even when I didn't. 83 conference trips. 2 times he disappeared without explanation, saying the flights were delayed, the schedules changed. Minus cools. It happens, Maggie. You worry too much. I catalogued those absences the way I archived old negatives, carefully, without emotion. But every number was a small incision. I remember the night the first rumor came. He was in Reykjavik for a cardiology symposium. The phone rang close to midnight. The connection crackled like rain. You sound far away, I said. I am far away, he laughed. It's freezing here. You'd hate it. Send me a picture. The light's too dim. You'll only see my shadow. The line went dead. The next day, a postcard arrived. No return address. On the front, a blue bird perched on ice. Our marriage wasn't unhappy, just uneven. He moved in rhythms of emergency calls and applause. I moved in rhythms of quiet maintenance. I repaired what time broke, frames, papers, tempers. He thanked me with dinners, with jewelry I didn't wear, with promises to rest after the next big case. Sometimes, during those dinners, he'd reach across the table and squeeze my hand as if to anchor himself. You keep me steady, he'd say. If I ever lose my way, find me. I didn't know then how literal that request would become. People loved him. He had a gift. He could look at someone's pulse and make them believe their heart was safe. I watched him do it hundreds of times. He had that effect on me too. Once, after a long day, I asked half joking, "You heal everyone's heart, Will. Who heals yours?" He smiled. "You do. Every day you stay." At the time, I took it as love. Now I hear the echo differently, as a confession he didn't mean to make. He never liked being photographed. That irony didn't escape me, given my work. When I tried to take his picture, he'd always turn slightly away, as if light itself were too intrusive. "You don't need another photo, Maggie," he'd say. "You've got the real thing." But sometimes, when he thought I wasn't looking, he'd photograph me, quick, secret shots on his old film camera. I found dozens after he died, each labeled with date and time, none with captions. One of them, though, had initials scrawled in the margin, BJ. Back then, I thought it was, before June, my shorthand for sorting the negatives. Now, I know better. Money came, then silence. Wealth has a way of insulating sound. He hired an assistant, started traveling more. He brought home gifts books in languages I couldn't read, silk scarves that smelled faintly of someone else's perfume. "Patience," he said when I asked. "Grateful ones." Still, we kept the ritual. Sunday breakfast by the lake. He'd spread his notes on the table, and I'd fix the instant camera I used for my students. We talked about opening a proper studio once he retired. He never retired. He just kept going, like a man chased by the echo of his own heartbeat. Once, I confronted him, not out of suspicion, but exhaustion. "Will," I said one night, "you're gone so much. Do you ever hide things from me?" He looked up from his notes. "That patient?" Doctor look, the one meant to calm. "You're too serious again, Maggie. If I ever hid something from you, who'd understand me better than you?" And I, fool that I was, smiled, thinking it was devotion. I didn't see the deflection. I didn't see the wall he built so gently I mistook it for safety. The years blurred, marked by the steady tick of monitors and the softer tick of our own distance. I remember standing in the darkroom once, watching an image bloom under red light. His face, half shadowed, half smiling. For a second, I thought I saw a wing brushing his shoulder. A trick of exposure. I rinsed the print and pinned it to dry, never realizing I'd captured the ghost of the word that would undo me. Blue jay. Looking back, I wonder how many warnings I ignored. The smell of a foreign cologne on his lab coat. The anonymous card that arrived every December, signed only, "Fly safe." The carved bird charm I found in his drawer. The same species as in his sketches. When I asked, he said it was from a patient who believed birds carry prayers. Now I think the prayer was never for me. Even the small things sting in hindsight. He called me Maggie in public, Margaret, when serious. But someone else had a different name for him. The thought eats at me, that somewhere, for years, another woman whispered Blue Jay and he answered. I tell myself it doesn't change what we built. The clinic, the house, the dinners, the laughter. But it does. It rewrites them, line by line. Until I can't tell which memories are real and which were borrowed. After the funeral, when people ask what kind of man he was, I say the truth I can still manage. He fixed hearts. I don't add that he also broke one, quietly, expertly, the way only a doctor could clean incision, minimal bleeding, perfect precision. Because, despite everything, I still remember the warmth of his hands, the way he used to trace my wrist to find my pulse, smiling like he could read it. And I remember thinking, as long as he knows my rhythm, I'll never lose him. But I did, long before he died. Sometimes I think love is just a long misunderstanding between two people who keep translating the same silence differently. I once believed William and I spoke the same language of devotion. Now, with that one word, Blue Jay, I realize he'd been speaking in code all along. We were still poor then, but poor in the way that felt temporary, like weather that would pass if we just worked hard enough. Our apartment overlooked the alley behind the laundromat. Steam rose every morning and wrapped the window in fog, turning everything outside into ghosts. That was where William liked to sit and sketch. He'd prop his elbows on the windowsill, a dull pencil between his fingers, and tell me not to move. Stay just like that, he'd say. The light hits you right where the truth lives. I'd laugh. I'm not beautiful enough to paint, Will. He looked up, smiling the soft, crooked smile I'd memorized. You don't have to be beautiful. You just have to be real. That sentence stayed with me for decades. It became a charm I carried in my chest, a reason to forgive every absence, every unanswered call. He said I was real. That had to mean something. He would draw me in fragments, hands, shoulders, hair, half done. Never the whole figure. Perfection kills truth, he'd explain. I didn't understand what he meant, but I liked the way he said it, as if art were a kind of mercy. Sometimes he'd whistle while sketching, a low tune that fluttered at the edges of my hearing. I know now it was the same rhythm a blue jay makes when calling for its mate. Back then, I thought it was just his way of keeping time. We lived on black coffee and instant noodles, on rent extensions and borrowed hope. When he finally earned his first paycheck from the hospital, he brought home two things: a bottle of cheap wine and a ceramic mug printed with a small blue bird. For you, he said, so you'll think of me at work. I used that mug every day for years. I didn't notice that he had an identical one at the clinic until after he died. There was a night I can't forget. The rain had broken through the window frame and the floor was wet. He stood behind me, arms around my shoulders, the two of us reflected in the glass. You ever wonder what we'll look like when we're old? I asked. He kissed the top of my head. If I still have you by then, he said, I'll draw us again, same window, same light. We never got that old together, but that promise. So gentle, so ordinary, felt like forever at the time. On our first anniversary, he gave me a small painting. The same window, the same fog, and a bird perched on the ledge, wings spread as if mid-flight. I thought it was a metaphor for freedom, for our dreams finally taking off. I hung it above our bed. Years later, when I repainted the room, I noticed a faint initial in the corner of the canvas, BJ. I asked what it stood for. He shrugged, smiling. Just something I sign when I feel proud of my work. I believed him. It never occurred to me that B, J, wasn't a painter's flourish, but someone's secret name. There were so many of those tiny birds scattered through our life that I never connected. The print on his tie, the cufflinks shaped like feathers, the embossed symbol on his leather notebook. Once, a nurse at the hospital gifted me a card with the bluebird sticker on it. "Doctor said you like these," she told me. I smiled, confused. "I've never said that." She laughed. "Oh, maybe he meant he likes them." I shrugged it off, the way women are taught to smooth over the small, uncomfortable details. But the motif was everywhere, quietly nesting in corners of our marriage. I can still picture our kitchen table. Paint splatters, unpaid bills, one flickering lamp. He'd draw late into the night, and I'd work on restoring torn photographs, both of us hunched over different versions of the past. When he was done, he'd show me his sketch. Sometimes it was a heart's anatomy, sometimes a bird taking off from a hand. "Think it's good?" he'd ask. "It's alive," I'd answer. He'd smile, tuck the drawing into a folder, and promise, "One day we'll frame them." We never did. They stayed folded, stacked behind tax records and electricity bills, blue wings pressed flat between years. The last image of that period that still feels pure is from a Sunday morning. I was at the stove, flipping pancakes that burned at the edges. He was at the table, sketching again. He looked up suddenly and said, "Hold still." I froze, spatula in hand. He drew for a long time, tongue between his teeth, that look of total focus I always found endearing. Then he turned the sketchpad toward me. It was me, laughing, mid-motion, but behind me, through the window, a tiny bird was flying away. "Why the bird?" I asked. "Because even happiness needs an exit," he said. I didn't understand what kind of man says something like that to the woman he loves. I only thought it sounded poetic. Years later, when I cleaned his office, I found that same sketch pinned behind a diploma. The ink had faded, but the outline of the bird remained vivid, its wings shaped like quotation marks around the life we'd shared. Now, every time I see that color, sky blue, fragile, free, I think of him, of me at the window, of a truth he drew before either of us could name it. He said I didn't have to be beautiful, only real. But maybe that was his permission to keep one part of his world unreal, hidden, drawn in another shade of blue. And that little bird, the blue jay, had been there all along, on the mug, on the wedding frame, in every sketch by his window. Fluttering quietly through our marriage, waiting for the day I'd finally notice it was never meant for me. It was 3 days after the funeral when Elise came back. I was in the kitchen, trying to wipe away the smell of lilies that had soaked into everything. Grief has a scent, sweet and rotten at once, and it clings to walls long after the mourners leave. The doorbell rang softly, twice. When I opened the door, she stood there holding a frame. Inside it, a small bouquet of dried blue flowers, pressed flat behind glass. "He asked me to keep these," she said quietly. "I thought you should have them now." Her voice was the kind you hear from someone who believes they're doing something kind, even as they're reopening a wound. I took the frame, noticing the inscription carved into the wooden border. "B.J. Summer 1985. My chest tightened. "B.J., I repeated. "What does that stand for?" She hesitated, just long enough for me to see the flicker in her eyes. Then she smiled, the way you smile when telling a child a softened version of the truth. "It was his nickname," she said, "when he volunteered in Iceland. Blue Jay. The blue bird of freedom." Her pronunciation lingered on the word freedom, like it meant more than it should. I gave a small, brittle laugh. Freedom from what? From who? For the first time, she didn't meet my gaze. Her eyes shifted to the framed photos on the mantel. Wedding, anniversary, the usual trophies of a long marriage. And then she said nothing. That silence, so measured, so deliberate, said more than words could have. I stood there, holding the frame as the light from the window caught the glass. The dried petals glowed faintly, the same shade as the mugs we used to drink from. Suddenly, I remembered the painting, the one of the window and the bird, and the initials in the corner. B.J. The same. It felt as if every object in my house had started whispering a secret I wasn't supposed to hear. "You were close then," I said finally. Elise tilted her head. Can we work together? That's all. I smiled. The polite kind of smile that hides a bruise. Of course. That's all. She reached out and touched my arm. Her hand was cool, steady. He admired you, Margaret. Truly. Admired. Not loved. Admired. Like a piece of art. Beautiful, but finished, hanging on the wall of his other life. I nodded, pretending to believe her. Thank you for bringing this, I said, and placed the frame carefully on the table. The moment she left, I locked the door. I sat staring at the dried bouquet for a long time. The flowers were brittle, pale blue fading into gray. Each stem was tied with a thin white thread, meticulous, like him. I tried to imagine when he'd given them to her. The year carved on the frame, 1985, was the year he told me he'd spent the summer at a medical exchange in Boston. I was 25 then, working double shifts to cover his tuition. Every week he wrote letters that began the same way. My dearest Maggie, the weather here is gray, but I think of you and the sun comes out. There were no flowers in those letters. No mention of Iceland. No mention of her. I took the frame to my studio and set it on the work table. Under the lamp, the glass caught a faint fingerprint. Not mine. I pressed my thumb against it, aligning them like a comparison test. It didn't fit. I traced the carved letters. B. J. Over and over until my fingertip hurt. That name again. That shadow name. For 30 years he'd been two people. William Hale, the doctor, and B. J, the blue jay. One saved hearts. The other escaped them. That night, I dreamt of him calling me from far away. His voice was faint, broken by wind. Maggie, I'm free. When I woke, the frame had fallen from the table. The glass hadn't shattered, but the corner cracked, a perfect split running through the word summer. I didn't pick it up. I just sat there, staring at it until morning, realizing that maybe Elise hadn't come to comfort me at all. Maybe she'd come to return what was hers. And for the first time, I saw something in her eyes that I hadn't noticed before. Not pride, not rivalry, but pity. As if she knew I was the last to arrive at my own story. A week after the funeral, the hospital organized a memorial for William, a formal event in the auditorium, all glass walls and white flowers. His colleagues called it a celebration of Dr. Hale's legacy. I wore black again, though the fabric already felt heavy with memory. My hands still smelled faintly of lilies no matter how often I washed them. When I arrived, the room was half full. Nurses, residents, former patients. All whispering, waiting for the slideshow to begin. Elise was there too, sitting in the front row, her sea blue scarf draped neatly over her shoulders. She didn't look at me, but I felt her presence like a pulse behind my ribs. The program started with the expected things. His medical breakthroughs, his research, smiling photos of him at conferences. The narrator spoke about his dedication, his kindness, his unwavering humanity. People nodded. I sat quietly, hands folded on my lap, reminding myself to breathe. Then the final slide appeared. It wasn't me. It wasn't our wedding photo or the Christmas portrait he'd framed in his office. It was William and Elise, standing by a lake. He was laughing, a deep, unguarded laugh I hadn't seen in years, and his arm was draped around her shoulder. The sky behind them was impossibly blue. A murmur rippled through the audience. Felt the air thicken. Someone in the row behind me whispered, "She looks so much younger in that picture." My throat closed. My palms went damp. I stood up, slowly. My voice came out steadier than I felt. "Excuse me. Who chose that photo?" The moderator, a young nurse, cheeks flushed with confusion, stammered, "It was, Dr. Elise. She said Dr. Hale wanted that picture as his farewell image." There was a collective pause, like everyone was waiting to see what I'd do. I tried to speak again, but something inside me cracked. My fingers slipped on the plastic cup of water I'd been holding. It fell to the floor. A small, ordinary sound, yet it echoed through the entire hall. The murmur stopped. Dozens of eyes turned toward me. I bent to pick it up, but my knees wouldn't bend. The cup rolled under the chairs, spilling what little was left. clear water seeping into the carpet like something that couldn't be taken back. Elise rose from her seat and took a hesitant step toward me. "Margaret," she began softly, he wanted people to remember him happy. Happy. With her." I straightened up, every breath sharp in my chest. "And what was I, Elise?" I asked. "His footnote?" No one moved. Even the slideshow froze on the screen, their faces smiling in eternal brightness. "I was married to him for 30 years, I said, my voice cracking once, then hardening. 30 years, and I've never even seen that photograph." The moderator whispered something to the technician. The lights dimmed. The screen went black, but it was too late. The image had already burned into everyone's eyes, and into mine. Someone coughed. A few people pretended to look at their phones. The silence was thick, with the polite discomfort of witnesses who wished they hadn't seen the truth. Elise reached for me again, but I stepped back. "Don't," I said quietly. "Not here." I walked out before anyone could stop me. The sound of my heels against the marble floor was the only thing I could hear. Sharp, uneven, human. Behind me, the crowd exhaled in a collective sigh of relief, as if the scandal had left the room with me. Outside, the wind was cold and wet. I stood beneath the awning, shaking, staring at my reflection in the glass door. My lipstick had faded. My eyes looked older than they had that morning. For the first time since William's death, I didn't cry. I just felt hollow. A shell that grief had already excavated and betrayal was now moving into. It was strange. I wasn't angry at Elise. I wasn't even angry at him. I was angry at myself for being surprised, because the truth wasn't new. It had been whispering all along, in blue mugs, in doodled birds, in initials I refused to question. I had chosen not to hear it. When I finally got home, I poured a glass of wine, set it on the table, and turned off every light in the house. The only glow came from the frame Elise had given me, the pressed flowers shining faintly under the lamp, the carved letters B. J. Summer, 1985. I stared at it until the room began to blur. Then, in the quiet, I heard my own voice, low and steady, speaking to no one. In the moment people said goodbye to my husband, I realized I was just a guest at the funeral of my own life. That night, the house felt heavier than it ever had. Even the air seemed to remember him. The faint scent of antiseptic, the muted ticking of the wall clock he loved for its precision. I walked from room to room, turning on every light, then off again. Brightness made no difference, the emptiness stayed the same. On his piano, the stack of sheet music waited. He had written them over the years, not for concerts, just for himself. Each page filled with precise, elegant notes, too neat for the man I thought I knew. I lit a candle. Its flame wavered like a pulse. One by one, I fed the pages to the fire. The paper curled inward, the ink blackened, and the smoke rose in thin spirals that smelled of dust and memory. I burned everything. Every sonata, every love song he claimed was unfinished, until only one page remained. The last one. The one signed in the corner with that name. Blue Jay. I didn't burn it. Instead, I slid it beneath a glass frame and took a pen. In the blank space below his signature, I wrote, no longer a code, a confession. Then, I set it on the mantel, where anyone entering my house would see it first. A shrine, perhaps, or a warning. I opened the drawer where we kept our joint savings passbook, William and Margaret Hale. The names looked strange together now, like two signatures from different worlds. For years, I treated that account as our future: retirement, travel, safety. Now it looked like a debt. I withdrew my share the next morning. Not because I needed the money, but because for once in my life, I wanted to touch something that was only mine. The teller hesitated, maybe recognizing the name. "Are you sure, Mrs. Hale? It's a large withdrawal." I smiled, calm, almost relieved. I've never been more sure. When she handed me the envelope, it felt surprisingly light. Freedom often does. Back home, I opened his study. It still smelled of graphite and aftershave. On the desk lay his medical bag, his fountain pen, the worn leather notebook he carried everywhere. I flipped through it, expecting medical notes, but found sketches instead. Pages of birds. Hundreds of them, drawn in quick, confident lines. Each one flying in a different direction. Each one titled, For B. I laughed. A short, sharp sound that startled even me. How careful he had been, cataloging his secrets with the same precision he used to diagnose a heart. I sat down in his chair, fingers resting on the closed notebook, and whispered, I hope you found your freedom, Blue Jay. Because now, I'm claiming mine. For years, I'd lived by his rhythm, his hospital shifts, his conferences, his moods. My own life had been a faint echo in the background of his melody. But that night, something inside me shifted. It wasn't rage. Rage burns too fast. This was clarity. Cold, clean, absolute. I made tea instead of wine, opened the window and let the night air in. The moonlight hit the framed sheet music, reflecting the words I'd written. No longer a code. A confession. For the first time, the name Blue Jay didn't sting. It didn't even belong to him anymore. It was mine now. Reclaimed, redefined. I sat at the kitchen table with a blank notebook, the kind I used to teach my students to restore photographs, starting from nothing but memory. I wrote a single sentence across the first page. If my whole life has been a supporting role in his story, then tonight, I begin my own chapter. The pen bled slightly into the paper, leaving a small halo around the words. It looked imperfect, alive. I thought about the years I'd spent waiting for him to come home, waiting for him to tell me the truth, waiting for someone to notice that my silence had weight. But waiting, I realized, is just another form of obedience. And I had obeyed long enough. Why? So I started to plan. Not revenge. Something quieter, steadier. A reconstruction. I knew how to restore damaged things. It was what I did for a living. But this time, the artifact was myself. I cleared his trophies from the bookshelf and replaced them with my restoration tools. Brushes, cotton swabs, magnifiers. I took down his degrees, rolled them up, stored them in the attic. The empty wall looked naked at first, but honest. I found one of my old photographs, a faded print from the year we met, and restored it under my lamp. I cropped him out. Just me, standing in that foggy window light he once said was where the truth lived. I smiled at the symmetry of it. You were right, Will, I whispered. The truth does live here. You just didn't know whose it was. Later, when I lay in bed, the silence didn't feel cruel anymore. It felt like space, the kind that belongs to no one else. I closed my eyes and listened, half expecting to hear the old rhythm of his breathing beside me. Instead, I heard my own, slower, steadier, alive. I realized then that grief is not just about missing someone. Sometimes it's about meeting yourself again after a long absence. The next morning, I didn't make his coffee. I didn't set 2 mugs on the counter. I poured 1 cup, mine, into the old ceramic mug he'd given me years ago, the one with the bluebird painted on it. Then I took a black marker and drew a small crack across the bird's wing. Not to break it, just to mark that it had survived. If I had spent my life being a shadow in his story, I was finally stepping into the light of my own. And for the first time, that light didn't blind me. It warmed me. The days that followed were unnervingly quiet, the kind of quiet that feels less like peace and more like a breath being held. The house seemed to listen. Even the floorboards creaked slower, cautious of what might come next. I'd begun to move differently, deliberate, measured. No longer the widow trying to make sense of loss, but the woman learning what to do with it. I stopped answering condolence calls. I stopped pretending gratitude for sympathy I didn't ask for. Grief, I'd learned, made people generous with words they didn't mean. Then the phone rang again. A landline call. The kind that still carried static. The kind that never brought good news. Mrs. Hale? A young woman's voice asked. Yes. This is Dana from the clinic. I just wanted to confirm. There's a transfer request for the clinic's ownership. We need your signature. My pen froze mid-air above the grocery list I'd been writing. Transfer? I asked. To whom? The girl hesitated. Elise Bennett. For a moment, all I heard was the faint buzz of the line, like a heartbeat through metal. She claims Dr. Hale intended to name her as successor, the girl continued carefully. There's a form she sent over, already signed by her legal advisor. We just need your approval as co-owner. I closed my eyes. I could picture it clearly. Elise in her blue scarf, smiling that serene, practiced smile while claiming what was left of him. I almost laughed. The audacity was poetic. Tell her, I said slowly, that she can keep his name on the door, but she'll never own his soul. The girl didn't answer at first. Maybe she didn't understand. Maybe she did. Should I? Write that down, ma'am? I smiled into the receiver. No. Just make sure she hears it. After I hung up, I sat there for a long time, listening to the tick of the wall clock, the one he used to wind every Sunday. The sound was steady, obedient, loyal. Everything he hadn't been. I poured myself tea, the same routine I'd performed for decades, but the cup felt heavier now, as if even porcelain carried the weight of recognition. Through the window, I could see the clinic across the street, the lights still burning long after closing hours. For years, that glow had been my comfort, proof that he was near, saving lives. Now, it looked like a beacon someone else had claimed. The curtains inside moved. A figure crossed the window. Elise. She turned off the lamp, and the building went dark. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay awake, tracing the patterns of light from passing cars on the ceiling. Each beam flared and vanished, like a heartbeat refusing to flatline. For a moment, I wondered what she thought of me. The wife in the background, the footnote in the story she thought she owned. Did she pity me? Fear me? Or worse, did she think I'd simply fade away, like a name erased from a letter? I whispered into the darkness. You miscalculated, Elise. The silence answered back, almost like a warning. The next morning, I found an envelope slipped under my door. No stamp, no name. Inside was a printed notice from the hospital board. Request for transitional partnership review. At the bottom, typed neatly, Mrs. Dr. Elise Bennett. I folded the paper in half, then in half again, until it was small enough to disappear into my palm. My hands didn't shake this time. I'd already learned. Fear doesn't live in the noise, it hides in the quiet. And I was done hiding. I spent the rest of the day cleaning. Not as a distraction, but as ritual. I scrubbed the counters, rearranged the books, dusted the frames. Every motion was an act of reclaiming. My house, my name, my narrative. When I reached the piano, the framed sheet music caught the light, Blue Jay, and underneath, my handwriting. No longer a code. A confession. I smiled. You can have the clinic, Elise, I whispered, but you can't have the story. That part's mine. Outside, the wind picked up, carrying the faint scent of rain. I stood by the open window and breathed it in. There was something electric in the air, a storm forming just beyond the horizon. For the first time in months, I wasn't afraid of it. Because now, I knew, the calm before the storm isn't silence. It's preparation. And I was ready. I told myself I was only going there to sign papers, to end it cleanly. But truth never stays clean for long. The day was overcast, the kind of light that flattens everything into gray. I walked across the street toward the clinic. Our clinic. The place where my fingerprints still lingered on the old doorknob, where every corner carried my shadow. Inside, nothing had changed. And yet everything had. The air smelled of antiseptic and lilies again, the same combination as the funeral. The waiting room was full, patients flipping through magazines, nurses typing quietly, the hum of machines pretending not to listen. Elise, standing at the reception counter, arranging a vase of fresh flowers. Blue hyacinths, of course. She turned when she heard my footsteps. Margaret, she said, her voice soft, practiced. You're still coming here? I looked straight at her. I used to scrub every drop of blood off this floor, I said evenly. Do you know that? Her lips curved into a faint smile. I do. And I used to clean his wounds before you ever came along. For a moment, even the machines stopped humming. The nurse behind the counter froze, eyes flicking between us. The silence was surgical. Sharp, sterile, cutting through the air. I walked closer, the sound of my heels crisp against the tiles. Funny, I said. You always had a talent for keeping things spotless. Especially secrets. Elise's expression didn't change. Margaret, this isn't necessary. We're both adults. William's gone. Let's not make a scene. A scene? I let out a dry laugh. You've already made one, in front of an entire hospital. You chose the picture. You wrote his ending. The color drained from her face, just a shade, but enough for me to see it. A young nurse stepped forward. Dr. Bennett, should I? Elise lifted a hand. It's fine. We're just talking. No, I said loudly, turning so that everyone could hear me. We're telling the truth. A few patients looked up from their magazines. The room stilled. If anyone here wants to know who Dr. Hale loved most, I said, voice firm, almost calm. Remember this? The last person he spoke of before he died wasn't her. I paused, watching Elise's throat tighten. It was my mother. A ripple moved through the crowd, a faint murmur, quick glances, curiosity disguised as sympathy. Elise blinked, trying to steady herself. You shouldn't, she began. He interrupted. Speak in public? You already used his voice to write your story. I'm just taking mine back. Her eyes darted toward the staff, a silent plea for them to look away, to make me invisible again. But no one moved. Even the clock on the wall seemed to stop ticking. I stepped closer, lowering my voice so only she could hear. Do you know what he said the day he met you again? He came home, sat right there by that window, and told me he'd seen a ghost. He said it made him feel young. I smiled and asked if the ghost was kind. He said, she's familiar. I didn't realize then he meant you. Elise's lips parted, the first crack in her calm. He never stopped caring for you, she whispered, almost pleading. Don't ruin that memory for yourself. Oh, Elise, I said quietly, you're still talking like you're the wife. Her face hardened. He loved me before he ever married you. And yet, I said, straightening, he died with my name on every document he owned. The words landed like a slap. Not loud, but precise. The receptionist tried to fill the silence with the click of her keyboard. No one else dared to move. I looked around the clinic. At the posters I'd framed, the plants I'd chosen, the counter I'd wiped down for years. Every inch of it was mine once, in ways Elise could never understand. You can repaint the walls, I said. Change the scent, even replace the name on the door. But you can't rewrite who built it. Elise drew a slow breath, her composure returning. If this is about money, Margaret, don't insult me. Her eyes flashed. Then what do you want? I smiled, not kindly. The truth, out loud, for once. She hesitated, then looked around at the staff, realizing there was no escaping the audience. A thing, she said quietly. Yes, he and I were close. Long before you. We met during a volunteer trip, Iceland, 1985. We kept in touch. And did you stay in touch through 30 years of my marriage? Elise looked down. Sometimes letters, sometimes calls. He said you were difficult to talk to about certain things. I laughed again. That brittle sound grief turns into when it loses patience. He was right. I was difficult to talk to about lies. I turned to the people watching. The nurses, the patients, the ghosts of our shared life. You hear that? I said. That's what betrayal sounds like. Polite, professional, perfectly reasonable. No one spoke. Someone dropped a pen, it clattered on the tile like a gavel. For years, I continued, I helped him build this place. I cleaned the floors, balanced the books, brought lunch when he forgot to eat. I watched him save hearts while he quietly broke mine. And now, the woman who hid behind his initials wants to own his clinic? Elise stepped forward, her voice shaking just enough for me to notice. He trusted me, Margaret. He said I understood him. You did, I said. You understood the version of him he wanted to be when no one was watching. I picked up the pen from the counter, the same brand he used, and scribbled something on a blank clipboard sheet. The ink bled slightly through the paper. I handed it to her. That's my signature, I said. The one you wanted. But it's on a blank page. Lads, you can fill in whatever you like. That's what you've always done, isn't it? Her hand trembled as she took it. You're cruel. No, I said. I'm just finished. I turned to leave but stopped at the door. Every head was tilted toward us, a crowd pretending not to stare. I faced them one last time and said, clear enough for everyone to hear. If anyone ever asks who Dr. Hale truly loved, remember this. The last name he spoke before he died wasn't hers. It was my mother's. Gasps rippled through the room. Elise's face went white. And just like that, I was done. I walked out, heels clicking against the disinfected tiles, the faint scent of antiseptic and wilted flowers following me. Behind me, the murmurs began, soft at first, then spreading like static through the sterile air. By the time I reached the door, the clinic felt smaller. The lights too bright, the silence too loud. I stepped outside and closed the door behind me, letting the metal handle slip from my hand. The cold air hit my face like truth. I didn't need to win. I only needed to end it on my feet. By the next morning, the story had already spread. They called it a scene, of course. The kind of thing polite people whisper about over coffee. The widow couldn't let go. She embarrassed herself in public. You know how grief makes women hysterical. Within 2 days, the local paper ran a small column, Widow Blocks Late Doctor's Legacy Transfer. No mention of names, but everyone knew. In a town this size, anonymity was a myth. The headline made it sound like I was vandalizing a monument, not defending my own life. My phone became a stranger. Messages blinked into existence at all hours. You should be ashamed. Let him rest. You were never enough for him anyway. Some were unsigned. Some came from numbers I once recognized. Friends, or people I had thought were friends, stopped calling. The same women who used to ask for recipes or book recommendations now crossed the street when they saw me. At the grocery store, a cashier who'd once adored William avoided my eyes. On social media, someone commented under an old photo of us. He looks happier in the hospital pictures. I didn't delete it. I didn't reply either. There's a kind of power in silence, when you know it's the prelude to something louder. I spent most nights at my desk, the lamp throwing a small circle of light across the papers. If they wanted a war of perception, I would fight it the only way I knew how. Through evidence. My profession had taught me that truth hides in the margins, in dust, in cracks, in data most people overlook. And I started digging. Old email backups, shared drives from the clinic, receipts, invoices, travel itineraries. I built folders like case files. Every document, a fragment of the man I'd thought I knew. Then, one night, I found it. An image attachment buried in a chain of work correspondence. A photo of a lake, 2 blurred figures, the same scene from the memorial slideshow. The file name, for my Blue Jay. JPEG, taken, 2008. My hands went cold. I right-clicked, opened the properties. The metadata appeared in neat, unfeeling lines. Camera, Nikon D90. Taken by Margaret Hale. For a second, I couldn't breathe. Dotties asked to cast in. I had taken that photo. I remembered the day now. We'd gone to the lake for his birthday. I'd borrowed his camera, told him to stand by the water while I adjusted the settings. I must have pressed the shutter without realizing he'd moved closer to someone else. He had kept the picture, cropped me out, and sent it to her. For my Blue Jay. I stared at the screen until my reflection blurred into his ghost. And then, for the first time since the funeral, I felt something close to peace. Not forgiveness, not yet, but clarity. I took a screenshot of the metadata and saved it to a new folder on my desktop. Evidence. The file glowed faintly in the dark like a small, steady heartbeat. After that, the fear began to fade. In its place came focus. I started to see the patterns Elise had left behind. The way her name appeared on invoices, her initials tucked into research drafts, her signature overlapping his on conference forms. She wasn't just claiming his memory, she'd been building her inheritance long before he died. When the journalists called for a statement, I refused. But I sent them documents, anonymously, copies of co-authored articles, where my husband's sections had been replaced with hers, bank transfers labeled as consulting fees, and, finally, the photograph. No explanation, just truth, stripped bare of my emotion. Within a week, the whispers changed tone. Did you hear? That friend might have been more than a friend. Apparently, the widow has proof. The same voices that once pitied me now turned curious. And in that curiosity, I found power. One evening, I went out for coffee. The same cafe where William used to meet his patients off record. The barista looked nervous handing me the cup. "Sorry, Mrs. Hale," she said softly. "People talk too much." I smiled. "That's all right. Let them. I'm done being their secret." Back home, the mailbox overflowed with sympathy cards and veiled insults. One envelope, though, stood out. No sender, no address, just my name written in neat handwriting. Inside was a single note. "Stop digging. You won't like what you find." No signature. But the ink smelled faintly of the same perfume Elise wore. I laughed out loud, not because it was funny, but because it was so predictable. People like her always underestimate silence. They think a quiet woman stays quiet forever. By then, I had already assembled my file, a chronological archive of a double life. Photos, letters, receipts, flight logs. Every proof that Blue Jay was not a symbol of love, but of lies. I printed each page and bound them in a folder labeled "For Record." No anger, no accusations, just facts. It felt clinical, almost therapeutic, like restoring a damaged photograph to reveal what had always been there. Sometimes, late at night, I'd imagine him watching me from wherever he was, not judging, not even sorry, just surprised. He used to say, "Maggie, you see too much." And I'd laugh, thinking he meant it kindly. Now I understood. Seeing too much is dangerous, especially when the world prefers a blind widow to a woman who knows. A week later, I received another call from the clinic, not from a nurse this time, but from the hospital board itself. "Mrs. Hale, we're reviewing the ownership claim. We'd like to meet with you." "Of course," I said. "Was I bring anything?" "Just whatever documentation you have." I looked at the thick folder on my desk, its spine straight, its pages humming with truth. "Worry," I said. "But I'll bring everything." That night, I made one last addition to the file. A copy of his final medical report. The one listing cause of death. "Cardiac arrest," it said. "Time of death, 3:42 a.m." But scrawled in my husband's own handwriting at the bottom margin was a note I'd never seen before. "Tell her I'm sorry." No name, no date. Just those words, nearly illegible, as if written in pain. I didn't know if her meant me or Elise. Maybe both. Maybe that was the only apology he was capable of. Still, I printed that page too, and placed it on top of the others. Because even lies deserve their final witness. When I closed the folder, the house went still again. Outside, the wind rattled the shutters. Not violently, just enough to remind me that storms don't announce themselves with thunder. Sometimes, they begin with a whisper, "You won't like what you find." Because, for the first time in 30 years, I knew exactly where the truth lived. In the quiet hands of the woman no one expected to fight back. And in that stillness I realized, peace isn't the absence of pain. It's the moment you stop being afraid to hold it. It happened near midnight, when sleep had stopped visiting me. I sat at his old desk, the one that still smelled faintly of cedar and coffee, scrolling through the archived folders of his email account. The password had been easy. The name of our first dog, the same one he used for everything. I half expected to find medical reports or patient files. Instead, a subject line caught my eye. "Transfer agreement. Final draft." My hand hesitated over the trackpad. Then I opened it. The document appeared, formal and pristine. Contract of transfer for the Hale Cardiology Clinic to the Elise Bennett Foundation. The date stamped at the top stopped my breath. Signed, 3 days before he died. For a long time I just stared at it. His digital signature, smooth and perfect, next to hers. The cursor blinked at the bottom of the screen like a metronome counting the seconds it took for disbelief to harden into understanding. 3 days. While I was cooking his favorite soup, washing his shirts, keeping vigil beside the bed where he complained of fatigue, He had been signing away the only thing we had built together. I leaned back in the chair and laughed. Short, sharp, almost feral. How poetic, I said to the empty room. You couldn't spare the breath to say goodbye, but you found time to hand your heart to someone else. The laughter died as quickly as it came. What replaced it was a kind of still calm, the kind that comes when a wound stops bleeding and starts to scar. I read every page. The Foundation's mission sounded noble, promoting cardiovascular research and supporting young female practitioners. How generous of him, and how convenient for her. There, in legal print, was the name Elise Bennett, Executive Director, followed by a clause that froze me completely. The estate of Dr. William Hale waives all claim to the property upon his passing. The estate, not his widow. As if I had already been erased from existence. I scrolled down to the witness section. A familiar name, the hospital's legal advisor, a man who'd attended our anniversary party 2 years before. He'd eaten cake in my kitchen, called me Maggie, kissed my cheek and toasted to 30 more years. 30 more years that never came. I printed the file, each page sliding out of the machine with a quiet hiss. The sound was oddly soothing, like breath returning after being held too long. When the last page emerged, I placed my palm over his signature. The ink was only pixels, yet it still felt warm. I whispered, almost kindly, "You always did love your symbols, Will." You gave her the clinic, the heart, and left me the ashes. The house answered with silence, thick and steady. I poured a glass of wine, sat on the floor, and read the contract again. Every legal phrase glimmered with betrayal disguised as philanthropy. Foundation. The word itself mocked me. Something meant to support, to uphold. Yet it had been built on the ruins of my trust. I thought of the slogan on the hospital's wall, "Healing begins with truth." I wanted to carve underneath it, "and ends with signatures." When the wine was gone, I opened the window. The night air was cold and wet, carrying the faint sound of traffic from the distant highway. I held the printed contract out to the wind. The pages fluttered like white birds trying to escape. I didn't let them go. Not yet. Instead, I took a marker and wrote across the top page. THRE days before. Big, black letters. Evidence. Accusation. Obituary. Then I slipped the pages into my growing folder of proof. It struck me, absurdly, how orderly betrayal can look when formatted in legal margins. There were no love letters, no confessions, only clean fonts, numbered clauses, signatures aligned like soldiers. He must have thought that made it righteous, professional. But I knew better. Men like William always preferred the sterile kind of sin, the kind you can print and file. Long as the clock hit 2 a.m. I closed the laptop and let the dark settle. I could feel my heartbeat slowing, not with exhaustion but with resolve. He had handed over his life's work to her. I would hand over the truth to the world. Before going to bed, I left the printed contract on the piano, beside the framed sheet music marked Blue Jay. 2 signatures, 2 betrayals, 1 melody. The candle beside it flickered once, its light bending across the glass. For a fleeting second, the reflection looked like handwriting, as if the flame itself wanted to add a final note. Whispered into the glow, "You can rest now, Will. Your foundation is safe, but your legacy, that belongs to me." Then I blew out the candle. I'd spent weeks collecting proof of betrayal. But proof, I realized, is only half of justice. The other half is presentation. And I, of all people, understood presentation. Restoration wasn't only about preserving truth, it was about framing it so the world could see. That was how the idea came. Among William's belongings were dozens of anatomical sketches. Elegant, precise, unsettlingly beautiful. Years ago, the Museum of Medical Arts had requested them for a retrospective on human anatomy in modern illustration. William refused at the time, modestly claiming they weren't ready. Now, they were more than ready. They were my weapon. I called the curator, an old acquaintance who remembered me from my restoration lectures. I said, "I'd like to make a donation." There was a pause on the line. "Of Dr. Hale's work?" Not exactly, I said. Of our work. I explained that I'd found the original drafts, that many contained my notes on composition and contrast. I had proof of my contribution, receipts, correspondence, my handwriting in the margins. The curator hesitated for only a moment before saying, "We would be honored." For the next few nights, I worked like a woman possessed. I flattened each sketch between sheets of archival paper, catalogued them by year, and attached a signed statement to every frame. Created by Margaret Hale. Keeper of the originals, restorer of the foundation layer. It wasn't just art anymore. It was reclamation. When the museum confirmed the exhibition date, they asked how I'd like it titled. I thought of all the words that had followed me these months. Widow, hysteric, obstacle. None of them fit. Then my eyes drifted to the framed sheet music above the piano. Blue Jay. I smiled. "Call it the Blue Jay series," I said. It's what he would have wanted. The irony tasted sharp and perfect. I sent a formal invitation to Dr. Elise Bennett, written on heavy ivory paper with the museum's seal embossed at the top. "In gratitude for your past collaboration with Dr. Hale, you are cordially invited to the opening night of the Blue Jay series exhibition." I knew she wouldn't resist. Vanity was a reliable instinct. Meanwhile, I worked quietly with the museum's design team. The final display wall, the one facing the entrance, would bear a brass plaque listing the contributors. At the very bottom, etched deeper than the rest, a single line. Blue Jay series. Final sketch by Margaret Hale. The night before the event, I barely slept. I laid out my clothes. A black suit, simple, deliberate. No jewelry, no color. Let her shine, I would endure. To nothing. The truth doesn't need rehearsal. It only needs timing. Opening night was all polished marble and murmuring guests. The air smelled of varnish and champagne. Reporters hovered near the entrance, scribbling names. When I arrived, cameras flickered. Not for me, not yet, for the widow of the famous doctor. They always loved a resurrection story. And then Elise appeared. She was radiant, of course, wearing a sapphire dress that caught the light just right. She approached with the poise of someone walking through her own success. "Margaret," she greeted, leaning in as if we were allies. "I didn't expect you to come." "You should have," I said softly. "This is our night, after all." She laughed, a delicate, puzzled sound, and drifted away to greet the curator. I watched her from across the room as guests admired the sketches. She gestured gracefully, reciting stories about William's process, as if she'd been beside him every moment. I said nothing, not yet. At 8 o'clock sharp, the curator took the microphone. "We are gathered to celebrate the artistic legacy of Dr. William Hale, and the extraordinary hands that preserved his vision." He gestured toward me. "Mrs. Hale, whose restoration expertise ensured these works survived, has generously donated the originals to our collection." A light applause followed. Elise smiled faintly, unaware. Then the curtain behind the main wall slid open, revealing the final installation, a massive projection of the piece titled "The Heart in Flight." The plaque beneath it gleamed under the spotlight. Guests stepped closer, whispering. I saw them reading the inscription, their faces shifting from admiration to surprise. Elise turned toward me, eyes narrowing. "What is that?" she whispered. I walked to her side and looked up at the plaque. The letters caught the light like truth catching breath. "Blue Jay series, final sketch by Margaret Hale." I turned to her, voice low but firm. "It's the last thing he worked on," I said. "Finished after he signed your contract." Her face went pale. "You can't! He never—" "He did," I interrupted. "He just didn't know I was watching." The room had fallen silent, the kind of hush that comes when curiosity turns to revelation. Reporters raised their cameras. The curator, sensing something larger than art, simply stepped aside. I took one step forward, letting my words reach the crowd. For those wondering, this exhibition is not about death. It's about authorship. Sometimes, what's written as an ending is only someone else's signature. Applause came hesitantly, then louder, not out of pity but recognition. People understood, even if they didn't know why. Elise stood frozen. Her reflection in the glass looked smaller than I remembered. "You planned this," she said under her breath. "No," I said. "I prepared it. There's a difference." When the night ended, I lingered after the guests left. The hall was quiet again, just the hum of lights and the faint smell of dust warming under them. I stood before the plaque one last time, tracing the engraved letters with my fingertips. Margaret Hale. My own name, permanent at last. Outside, through the glass walls, the city lights shimmered like scattered embers. I thought of William, of his steady hands, his secrets, his careful lines. "I finished your sketch, Will," I whispered. "It only took me 30 years." And as I walked out of the museum, heels echoing against the marble floor, I realized I wasn't leaving anything behind. I was finally taking it back. Opening night was a storm disguised as applause. The museum atrium gleamed under chandelier light, glass walls reflecting hundreds of faces. Doctors, donors, journalists, former patients, all gathered to celebrate the Blue Jay series. I could feel the hum of cameras before I saw them, the rustle of tripods, the polite coughs of anticipation. I had dressed simply, deliberately. Black suit, silver brooch, nothing blue. Let the color belong to him. Let the truth belong to me. The curator began his speech, voice smooth as velvet. "Tonight, we honor the vision of the late Dr. William Hale and the unseen hands that preserved his legacy." He gestured toward me, flashes ignited like tiny explosions. I smiled, steady, the way one smiles for an X-ray, letting light pass through bone. Then came the inevitable question. A reporter with a press badge lifted her recorder. "Mrs. Hale, could you tell us the meaning behind the name Blue Jay?" The room stilled. Even the air conditioning seemed to pause. I met her eyes, then looked directly into the nearest camera lens, the black circle that had swallowed 1,000 lies already. "It's the final song," I said slowly, "of someone who thought they were free until they realized they'd been flying inside another person's cage." The words hung in the air. Clear, cold, irreversible. A collective murmur swept through the crowd, half shock, half curiosity. Somewhere, a champagne glass trembled against its stem. Elise stood across the room, near the wall of sketches. Her smile faltered for the first time that evening. She had come dressed like a headline. Sapphire silk, diamond earrings shaped like feathers. The perfect muse. A reporter turned to her. "Dr. Bennett," he asked, "is it true you were the inspiration for this series?" Her mouth opened, but no sound emerged. The camera lights found her face, flawless, frozen. For a heartbeat, I almost pitied her. Then she lowered her gaze, whispered something no one caught, and walked out, her heels clicking against marble, echoing like a retreating verdict. The crowd watched her go. Silence followed her exit, a silence thick with revelation. And then the applause began. Not loud at first. Hesitant, uncertain. But it grew wave after wave until the hall vibrated with it. I didn't bow. I only smiled. Not victory. Release. Afterward, reporters crowded around me, hungry for angles. "Did Dr. Hale dedicate these sketches to you, or to someone else? Was there tension between you and Dr. Bennett? What does this exhibition mean for the Foundation's ownership of the clinic?" I answered none of it. Instead, I said, "Art doesn't expose people. It just removes the curtains they hang in front of themselves." That line made the morning papers. They called it the widow's quiet triumph. But it wasn't triumph I felt. It was weightlifting, air returning. Later that night, after the guests dispersed and the photographers packed their equipment, I wandered the exhibition alone. The hall was still, the air faintly scented with varnish and perfume. Each sketch looked alive under the soft light. Hearts, lungs, veins, all in motion. I stopped before the largest canvas, the heart in flight. It showed an anatomical heart splitting open into wings, a bluebird emerging from red muscle. People had called it symbolic, romantic, tragic. Only I knew it was a confession. I reached out and traced the brass plaque beneath it. BLUJ. Series. Final. Sketch by Margaret Hale. The letters were cool beneath my fingertips. For the first time in years, my name didn't feel like an echo of his. It stood on its own, sharp and clean. Behind me, footsteps approached. The curator. "It was quite a night," he said softly. "You handled it with grace." "Grace is cheaper than revenge," I replied. He smiled. "Will you donate more of his work?" "No," I said. "Everything left belongs to the living." He nodded and left me to the silence. I sat on one of the benches in the middle of the hall. My reflection shimmered on the polished floor, one figure surrounded by hundreds of hearts pinned to walls. For years, I'd been the background of a man's story. Tonight, I'd turned his legacy into my mirror. It didn't feel cruel. It felt necessary. I thought about the line I'd told the reporter, the bird in the cage, and realized I'd been speaking to myself all along. We spent half our lives building cages. We later mistake for homes. Mine had gold handles and medical degrees and a last name that once meant safety. Now, all that was left was air. Clear, breathable, mine. Outside, the city buzzed with the aftermath. Headlines flashed on phones. "Widow reclaims Blue Jay legacy." A different kind of freedom. At a nearby cafe window, I caught sight of my own photograph on the evening news. My face calm, eyes direct. For a brief moment, I looked like the version of myself I'd always been trying to find. I didn't go home right away. Instead, I walked to the lake. The same one from that photograph years ago. The one he had cropped and sent to her. The water was dark, moonlight glinting like small blades on its surface. I took the museum invitation from my bag and folded it into a paper bird. Then I placed it on the water and watched it drift until it sank. "You can keep your wings, William," I whispered. I found mine. When I finally returned home, the piano still held the framed sheet music. Blue Jay. The candle beside it had burned down to wax. I didn't relight it. Some lights don't need to burn forever. They just need to show the way once. I poured a glass of water, sat by the window, and watched dawn edge over the rooftops. The world outside was washed clean, color returning where gray had been. I thought of Elise somewhere packing her things, of lawyers drafting statements, of newspapers filling columns with speculations. None of it mattered anymore, because truth, once seen, doesn't need defense. It simply exists. Later that morning, the curator called. "There's already talk of extending the exhibition," he said. "The public loves the story. Stories always sell better when they bleed," I said. "Just make sure mine doesn't." He hesitated. "You're sure you're all right?" I looked at the framed sheet music on the piano, at the word Blue Jay glowing faintly in the light. "I'm better than all right," I said. "I'm finished." I ended the call and opened my notebook, the one I'd started the night I burned his music. On a blank page, I wrote a single line. Some secrets don't need revenge. Once exposed to light, they burn themselves. I underlined it once, then closed the book. That was my epitaph for us. At noon, I returned to the museum one last time. The halls were quiet, sunlight filtering through glass like melted gold. A few visitors wandered silently, their footsteps soft against marble. One woman, middle-aged, holding her daughter's hand, stopped beside me. "It's beautiful," she said, nodding toward the heart in flight. "It is," I agreed. "Did the artist mean it to be so sad?" I smiled. "Maybe not sad," I said. "Maybe true." She nodded, thoughtful, then moved on. I stood there, letting the sound of their footsteps fade until it was just me and the heartbeat of the air. When I finally walked out into the sunlight, the sky was the same color as those birds he used to draw, the color of endings that pretend to be beginnings. I didn't look back. There are secrets that demand vengeance and others that need only light. This one, this cage made of love and lies, burned the moment I opened the window. And with that, the Blue Jay finally stopped singing. I came home long after midnight. The city had gone to sleep, leaving only the hum of street lamps and the faint hiss of rain on the roof. The museum lights still shimmered in my mind, so many eyes, so many flashes, and yet the house waited for me like something newly washed of sound. I unlocked the door and stepped into stillness. For the first time in months, the air did not smell of disinfectant or wilted lilies. It smelled of paint, fresh, clean, unapologetic. On the table leaned the canvas I had brought from the museum, The Last Blue Jay. I hung it on the wall above the piano, centered, straight, no frame this time. I wanted the edges raw, the way truth should be. When I stepped back, the colors caught the light. A heart, half open, a bird rising from it. The blues were softer now, less sorrow than sky. I whispered into the empty room, "William, you can fly if you must. But this time, the one taking off is me." I sat by the window with a cup of tea, the mug with the crack across the wing. Outside, dawn was starting to bruise the horizon, violet fading into gold. The neighborhood was waking. A dog barked, a milk truck rattled, life going on without ceremony. For the first time, I didn't resent it. Freedom, I was learning, doesn't roar. It exhales. I looked around the house and saw it differently. The same walls, but lighter. The same furniture, but honest. Everything that had once held his shadow now held light. The piano lid was open, its keys catching the pale sun. I pressed one note. The sound lingered, soft and steady, like a pulse rediscovering rhythm. The newspaper slid under the door around 7. I didn't rush to pick it up. When I finally did, the headline stared back at me. Blue Jay Exhibition redefines Dr. Hale's legacy. Below it, a smaller line. Widow's quiet strength reframes the art of truth. I smiled, not for pride, but because the world had finally spelled my name right. I clipped the article and placed it inside the same folder where I had once kept evidence. The folder felt lighter now. No longer a weapon, just a record. A reminder that the story had ended exactly where it should. Around noon, the phone rang. The curator again. "The attendance was record-breaking," he said. "People keep asking about the final painting. They call it hopeful." "Hopeful," I repeated. "That's a first." "What do you plan to do next, Mrs. Hale?" I looked at the painting on the wall, at the bird frozen mid-flight. "Giddy, maybe teach," I said. "Maybe just breathe." He laughed softly. "Whatever you do, keep that fire. It suits you." After we hung up, I turned off the phone. Some silences deserve protection. Later, I opened the window wide. The breeze lifted the curtains, carrying the smell of rain and new beginnings. On the piano, the sheet music fluttered. Blue Jay, the notes shifting like wings. I took a pen and wrote across the bottom margin, "It was restored by Margaret Hale." A small gesture, but it felt monumental. That afternoon, I walked to the park near the lake. The same one from the photograph. The same water that had once mirrored someone else's love. Now, it mirrored only sky. Children were feeding pigeons by the pier. One of the birds was bright blue, its feathers flashing against the gray. It hopped toward me, unafraid, and for a second I thought, maybe the universe has a sense of humor after all. I tossed it a crumb from my pocket and whispered, "You're free, little one. Don't waste it." The bird took off, a blur of color, disappearing into the glare of afternoon. When I returned home, the sun had shifted, casting the room in amber. It glowed. The crack in the mug gleamed like a vein of light. I realized I wasn't waiting for him to appear anymore. Not in dreams, not in photographs, not in apologies that never came. All that remained was the quiet knowledge that I had survived him, and in surviving had become something larger than grief. I poured myself another cup of tea and sat at the piano. My fingers hovered over the keys, uncertain. Then, slowly, I played the first notes of his unfinished melody. It was clumsy at first, but the sound filled the room, half memory, half rebirth. When the final chord faded, I let the silence hold. It wasn't empty, it was full. Freedom, I thought, isn't an escape from love. It's the moment you realize you can keep it without being caged by it. I looked once more at the painting. The blue jay's wings seemed wider now, the lines more alive. Maybe it was just the light, Or maybe it was me. Either way, I whispered, "Fly, William. I already have." And for the first time, the house didn't echo back his name. It echoed mine. A year passes quietly when you stop measuring it by pain. The seasons shift without ceremony. The house settles into peace the way the body heals after a long fever. Slow, tender, certain. By spring, I had turned the old living room into a studio. Light poured in through the windows I'd once kept closed. The floor, once cluttered with memories, now smelled of turpentine and fresh paper. The echo of his piano was gone. In its place, the hum of women's laughter began to bloom. That's how Echo Feather Studio was born, a place where women came to restore old paintings and sometimes themselves. They arrived carrying faded portraits, torn sketches, pieces of art that had survived floods, divorces, accidents. They came whispering, "It's ruined," and left saying, "Maybe it never was." I told them the same thing I had told myself. Nothing is beyond restoration. Not if you still have hands to mend and eyes to see. On the first day of class, I hung a single frame on the wall. Inside, it was a simple white card, embossed in gold letters, Blue Jay, restored by her. It wasn't a trophy. It was a truth. A reminder that some stories don't end, they simply change authors. Underneath, I placed the cracked mug. The one with the bird painted on it, now sealed in resin, unbreakable. Students often asked about it. I told them it was my first restoration project. Some days, I'd catch myself glancing at the piano in the corner. The keys were silent, but the dust on them glimmered in sunlight like soft feathers. I never played anymore. I didn't need to. The studio had its own rhythm. The soft scrape of brushes, the whisper of graphite, the occasional burst of laughter. One afternoon, a young student named Clara raised her hand. "Mrs. Hale," she asked shyly, "do you still paint birds?" Her question caught me by surprise. I smiled. "Yes," I said, "but now they don't need anyone else's wings." She didn't understand the meaning. Not yet, but one day she would. As the months unfolded, the studio grew, not in size, but in spirit. We hosted exhibitions of restored works, all signed not with famous names, but with initials of women who had once called themselves invisible. We called the first show The Second Light. Each canvas told the same story in different colors, survival disguised as art. Reporters came again, the same ones who had once cornered me at the museum. But this time, the headlines were different, from widow to founder, the woman teaching restoration of self. I didn't give interviews. I let the walls speak. Sometimes, when the day ended and the last student left, I'd stay behind to clean the brushes. The smell of paint mixed with rain from the open window. On those quiet evenings, I'd think of William. Not with anger, not even sorrow. Just distance. Like remembering someone from another lifetime. I imagined him somewhere. Not as the Blue Jay, not as the doctor, but as a man finally weightless, freed from the stories he built. "You got your flight," I'd whisper. And I got mine. One evening, as I was locking up, an envelope was slipped under the studio door. No address, no sender, just my name written in familiar handwriting. I hesitated before opening it. Inside was a photograph, an old one, of the lake where everything had once begun. On the back, a short note, "He would have been proud of you." No signature, but I knew. Elise. I stared at the photo for a long time, then placed it on the wall beside the mug. We had both carried our cages long enough. Perhaps she was learning, too, that freedom doesn't need applause. By the anniversary of the exhibition, I held an open class. No lessons, no agenda, just painting for the sake of breathing. Women from the previous batches returned, bringing flowers, laughter, and stories of small victories. New jobs, reconciled children, finally sleeping through the night. We painted together in silence, the kind that feels full rather than empty. Someone turned on the radio. The melody was unfamiliar, yet warm. When the song ended, I found myself saying softly, "There was a time I thought I couldn't live without him." The women looked up, waiting. Now I know I can't live without myself. As the sun set, the light pooled across the floor in shades of gold and blue. I realized that, somewhere along the line, grief had turned into color. Soft, forgiving, endless. I took out a small canvas I'd been saving and began to paint. Not a heart, not a bird, just open sky. No boundaries, no frame. When I finished, I signed my name in the corner, M. Hale. The simplest truth I owned. Later that night, I walked home through the quiet streets. The museum banners still hung downtown, faded now, flapping in the wind. I didn't stop to look. The story was finished. At home, I lit a single candle beneath the painting. The last blue jay. Its wings glowed under the flame. I spoke to the air, gently, as one speaks to a memory that no longer hurts. "You can rest, Will. The song is over." Then I smiled and blew out the candle. In the darkness, the afterglow lingered. Faint, golden, alive. Outside, a bird called once, clear and distant. Not a blue jay, not anymore. Glowing. Just a sound of flight. They say freedom is the absence of weight. But I think it's the moment you stop carrying what was never yours to hold. And in that moment, standing beneath my own painting, surrounded by laughter and light, I realized I was no longer the echo of his story. I was the voice of my own. The camera light blinked red, steady, unblinking, waiting for me to speak. I sat across from it, hands folded in my lap, the frame behind me showing the painting. The last blue jay. The studio was quiet except for the faint hum of the recorder. Outside, the evening was falling, soft and slow. The sky the color of forgiveness. I took a breath and looked straight into the lens. "If one day," I began, "someone comes to mourn the person you loved and calls them by a name you've never heard, don't be afraid." I paused. The silence settled like a heartbeat. "Maybe that name isn't theirs," I continued. "Maybe it's a code, a key left behind so you can finally find yourself." The light from the camera reflected in the glass frame behind me, making the bird's wings shimmer as if caught mid-flight. For a long time, I used to think freedom arrived, wrapped in noise, applause, justice, closure. But the truth is quieter than that. It arrives when you no longer need to prove that you were right, or loved, or remembered. It arrives the moment you stop waiting to be called by the right name and start answering to your own. I looked down at my hands, paint still faintly stained beneath the nails, and smiled. "There was a time," I said softly, "when I thought my life ended with him. But it didn't. It ended the day I stopped listening to the voice that said I couldn't live without being seen." I leaned forward slightly, voice steady now. "Share this story. Not for me, but for the woman who's still standing in a room full of ghosts, thinking she's the one who's disappeared. Let her know that sometimes freedom doesn't begin when you're loved. It begins when you no longer need to be called by the name someone else gave you." Behind me, the camera captured everything. The cracked mug on the table, the soft light on the canvas, the words, "Blue Jay," restored by her glowing faintly on the wall. They weren't props. They were proof. Proof that survival can be art, that pain can be translated into beauty if you give it a steady hand and enough light. "I don't believe in revenge anymore," I said finally. "I believe in restoration, in taking what was broken and letting it become something honest." I smiled again. Not the smile of someone finished, but someone free. Maybe that's all healing really is. Painting over the silence until it learns how to sing again. The cameraman gestured. 1 minute left. I nodded, looked into the lens once more, and said my last words. "Whiffer cells, my story ends here. But maybe, just maybe, this is the first song of my freedom." The light blinked off. The room fell silent. I stayed there for a while, breathing in the stillness, watching the reflection of the painting in the darkened lens. The blue jay no longer looked trapped between wings and cage. It looked midair, alive. And somewhere, deep inside that silence, I could almost hear it sing.